In June, we put together a super high-end system in a tiny chassis. And even in May, when we used a Ryzen 5 2600, that overall system build was not what you could really call cheap, as we used a bunch of fairly expensive other parts. But I know that a good amount of my audience isn't necessarily here to find out what a 7980XE can do, but rather to learn how to put together a solid bang for your buck system that will slay some frames at 1080p. So that's exactly what we're going to do in July's monthly build. This is a $700 1080p gaming system. Ready to dive into custom water cooling but unclear about what parts you might need? Check out Thermaltake's new M360 Plus RGB kit. Featuring a D5 pump res combo, 16mm hard tube, Pacific C Pro fittings, and the best RGB implementation on the market, the M360 Plus fits all mainstream Intel and AMD sockets and is fully expandable as your system evolves. Check out the link in the video description to learn more. So let me just cut off all the people in the comments who are about to type, well, I could build it cheaper. You probably could. But we're looking for some measure here of cohesiveness, expandability, and flexibility while not sacrificing too much when it comes to our wallet. Plus, it's always nice if it comes out looking pretty good too. The budget that I set for myself for this project was $700. And after tossing a bunch of parts together, I slowly trimmed a few things here or there until I hit that magic number. As always, this system cost does not include a Windows license, but nowadays there are so many ways to get discounted licenses that it seems almost silly of me to include a retail one for $100. Not to mention the fact that you can actually just install Windows 10 for free, and then you have up to a year to activate it after that. So let's start off with the brain of the system, the Intel Pentium Gold G5400. Ryzen 3 makes a strong argument for being the best budget chip. But when it comes down to it, the new Coffee Lake Pentiums are actually about 30% cheaper and still game relatively well. Not to mention the fact that ever since they switched over to being a 2-core processor with hyper-threading with the Kaby Lake generation, they've effectively become i3s instead of lowly Pentiums. I did a comparison test with 4 different Kaby Lake chips when that lineup launched and found that there was little or no gaming difference between the Pentium and the i3 lineup, unless you want to pay an absurd premium for the unlocked $170 i3 8350K. When it came to the cooler, this is actually one of the areas that I struggled with the most. Do I just use the included Intel stock cooler and call it a day? It certainly provides us with enough cooling capacity for our locked 2-core processor, and it also saves us a few bucks. But I wanted to make this build at least a little bit forward thinking. Of course I didn't want to go overboard, but what if somebody puts this together and then wants to upgrade in a year? Wouldn't it be easier to at least have an effective aftermarket air cooler that they could reuse? I also tend to not really lean on using the stock heatsink and fan unless we're going ultra budget, because this one really isn't good at all, unlike the ones that come from AMD. That's why I went with the Cooler Master MA410P. It's a tower cooler in the style of the famous Hyper 212, plus it adds some nice aesthetic touches with the RGB fan and black top plate. I'll be mounting the G5400 and the MA410P to the Gigabyte B360 Aorus Gaming 3 motherboard. Again, here I tried to consider all facets of the unholy triumvirate of price, features, future usefulness. And the Gaming 3 really hits all three pretty well. It costs less than $120 and is actually still quite a handsome product. It comes with an M.2 heatsink, RGB effects on the chipset cover and audio traces, and one of my absolute favorite features, onboard AC Wi-Fi. The best argument right now against the Coffee Lake processors is the uncertainty surrounding the future of the LGA 1151 socket that the Aorus Gaming 3 is built around. However, keep in mind that even if no more chips are ever made that utilize it, you can still step up to an i5 or even the i7-8700, which is basically the best gaming CPU on the market currently. We'll be using this M.2 heatsink right here for our storage solution, the very reasonably priced Crucial MX500 M.2 SSD. This is the 500 gig version, but only costs somewhere in the neighborhood of $105 to $110 because it uses the SATA interface rather than PCIe. However, it's still plenty fast for our needs, and 500 gigs should be plenty to get us up and running. If storage is a concern, you could opt instead for something like a 2 terabyte hard drive for even less money, but booting off of a hard drive is basically something that I just never want to have to do again, and I try to recommend that all builds start with at least a small SSD for Windows. With NAND prices currently dropping, it is a good time to explore the M.2 market if you've been hesitant in the past. Now, memory again was something that I struggled with a little bit. Although prices are starting to come back down to earth, they are still inflated, and I was having a tough time fitting in a 16 gigabyte kit and staying under budget. So instead I opted for a 2x4 gig Patriot kit of DDR4 2400. This is pretty basic stuff, but comes with a black heat spreader and costs less than $80. Patriot memory also has always been a solid performer for me, and for 1080p gaming 8 gigs should actually be just fine. If you want to reallocate some funds because you feel you definitely need a 2x8 gig kit, you could shave $40 by omitting the cooler and another $40 by maybe downgrading the storage solution. But at this point, you're kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul, and I think I'd rather have a more well-rounded build overall. The GPU selection was actually probably the easiest part of the selection process, as I knew all along I wanted to use the EVGA GTX 1050 Ti. At about $180, it slots right into where we want to be for graphics performance and price. It should have no problem powering our games at 1080p for the foreseeable future. Yes, there will likely be new GPUs coming soon that eclipse the 1050 Ti, but that doesn't take anything away from what this card is capable of. We could have also gone slightly cheaper with something like the AMD RX 560, but the 1050 Ti outperforms it in almost every game, and that's really what we're shooting for here. For power, Cooler Master sent over this Master Watt 550. It's 80 plus bronze certified with all black cables, and you can scoop it up for about $60. It also has enough wattage that if we wanted to upgrade to a more powerful processor or GPU in the future, we'd have no power concerns at all. It's going to tuck neatly underneath the shroud of the NZXT H500. Now, when NZXT reached out to me and asked which version of their S340 replacement I wanted to take a look at, I specifically requested the non-I model. That is the one without the smart fan and LED controller built in. I think that this case is much more interesting around $65 than up at around $100, and it really does call back to the aesthetic of the S340 Elite. And I think budget builders would rather have that $35 to spend somewhere else than have to pay for a smart controller that they likely won't use. Still though, NZXT does give you the option here, which is pretty good. The H500 has a tempered glass side panel, cable management aids around back, and decent airflow even in the stock configuration. So, how does our $700 1080p gaming system look and perform? Let's build it and find out.
Let me say that I wish all builds were this easy and went this smoothly. I ran into literally zero issues at all, and because we're using M.2 storage that doesn't require SATA power, and a 1050 Ti that doesn't need supplementary PCIe power, cable management was so remarkably clean and simple that it almost surprised me. Yes, we don't have a huge amount of glitzy lighting in here, but there's plenty of room for customization down the road, and we've got a really solid foundation to build on. First off, I really enjoyed building in this chassis. It reminded me of the S340 Elite, and there are even more convenient cutouts and cable routing points behind the tray than the original had. Cooling support is also surprisingly excellent, even in the stock double exhaust configuration. I was able to bump up the GPU clock by 100 MHz and the GDDR5 by 200 MHz, and still at 100% load for about 20 minutes, temps were constant at a breezy 57 Celsius. I then put the CPU under IDA64 stress for 18 minutes, and temps leveled out there at about 46 Celsius. Both of those numbers are crazy low and will ensure stable, efficient performance for years. Not to mention that the entire system is basically whisper quiet. This is one of the benefits of going with an aftermarket tower cooler as opposed to the stock Intel heatsink and fan, which would definitely have been much louder. Performance-wise, I think we're pretty much right where we expect it to be. As I've talked about in other videos in this series, all of my testing for these monthly projects is done at 1080p and ultra detail settings. This is maybe just a bit too much for this CPU-GPU combo to handle if you really want that silky smooth 60 frames per second experience in AAA titles. But by bumping down the settings just a notch, we can see how performance dramatically improves. With a few minor tweaks, we could see all of our testing titles hitting that magical 60 FPS mark or even higher. What I'd like to do in a follow-up video is see if we can make some changes just based solely on improving performance while maybe trying to stay around the same target budget. Maybe I can upgrade to 16 gigs of RAM and an i5 and downgrade our storage, CPU cooler, and maybe the chassis. I'll have to work through the permutations, but let me know down below in the comments what you'd like to see happen with this system. What should I replace and what should I keep? Make sure you get subscribed to the channel so you don't miss out on that follow-up video and many more just like this one. Thanks for watching, guys, and as always, I will see you next time.